Is Trump setting the new presidential standard, or is he going to break the system? Blaze News The Mandate starts right now. Welcome in, everyone. I'm Jill Savage, joined by Editor-in-Chief Matthew Peterson.
It is great to be here on the Fridays that we love, get the deep dives.
Yes, I mean, we watch the headlines all week. We know it's clear. We're not just fighting all the policy battles anymore. We're actually fighting to reclaim the structure that our founders built. So on Fridays, we like to take a step back and go a little bit deeper on America's foundation and what the founders actually intended and how far we've drifted. What a crazy concept, Matt.
I know, it's crazy. There's one of the people that I'd no better person to talk about than John Yoo, especially when it comes to executive power. He's a man who knows a thing or two about that, so this was a great one.
Yes, let's go ahead and get right into Matt's interview with UC Berkeley law professor John Yoo next. Well, some bourbons are out there chasing trends. Flying Ace actually chases legacy. It's straight bourbon, the way that it was meant to be. It's bold and balanced and unapologetically American. There's no gimmicks or fluff. It's just real whiskey made for people who still believe in hard work, high standards, and doing things the right way. Whether you're winding down after a long day or raising a glass with good company, Flying Ace delivers every time. It's not about hype, it's about heritage. It's about getting back to what bourbon was always supposed to be. So, if that sounds like you're kind of poor, it's time to level up. You can go buy it online at flyingacespirits.com and use the code BLAZE for free shipping.
It is good to see you again, John. I just had to leave the wonderful John Marshall Fellowships in the Claremont Institute in California, but John Yoo is in California, and you're someone who has worked in all three branches of government and is not just a professor, although you are that. And so I thought before we get into everything going on with the Trump administration now and the future of this administration, it would be great if you could lay out your vision, your understanding of how the founders in the early American Republic thought the president should relate to all the departments and everything underneath him. In other words, what kind of executive is this?
Oh, Matt, great to be with you. And yes, I'm currently imprisoned in California, trying to figure out ways to escape. But once you think you get out, they still pull you back in, to quote The Godfather. Here's how I see it. I think the Constitution sets up a very simple structure. There are three branches: the Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution, the President in Article 2, and the Judiciary in Article 3. They're what we call equal and independent branches, although they're coordinate, and they perform different functions. Article 2 gives the president the executive power. And as Justice Scalia said in his famous dissent in the independent counsel case, that doesn't mean some or any of the executive power. It is all of the executive power that the federal government has goes to the president. There are no other cabinet members or agencies mentioned in Article 2 that share that power, that responsibility to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, to protect the nation's security, and to exercise executive power falls on the president alone. So I see the other parts of the federal government in the executive branch as assistants to the president, aides to the president, to help him carry out his constitutional duty to take care of the laws are faithfully executed, to protect the nation's security and conduct foreign relations. And then the other duties that Congress, the legislature, or the judiciary gives to the executive branch to carry out.
So riddle me this. I mean, I think a lot of people out there, are confused by the situation we see today. And this is an overarching point when it comes to the presidency. It's not necessarily a partisan one. That the president is the executive. So that's the CEO. He's the boss. You just said, all this stuff sort of is there to help him accomplish his mission. And there's no other competition in the Constitution for this role. So, I mean, what is your way of explaining how we got to the point where Gosh, it sure doesn't seem like he's the boss. I mean, he can't just go in and fire everyone. He seems to have all these strictures, on that office where, President Trump comes in, for instance, and people wonder. I mean, he was the guy who said, "You're fired" on TV, for a long time. I think that had something to do with his victory. So how do we get to the place where, the president doesn't seem to be in control of all this enormous apparatus underneath him?
Well, two things, Matt. One is the Constitution actually doesn't say that the president can fire anybody. The Constitution talks about appointing people. The president, with the advice and consent of the Senate, appoints the principal officers of the government, like the cabinet officers, and appoints and confirms judges. But because the Constitution is silent about firing, people from James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, all the way through the Supreme Court to today, including myself, have argued, well, since the executive power is vested in the president, then that gives the president already the power to fire officials. And the Supreme Court has observed that without that power to fire, he can't get any of the subordinates to listen to him, because the Constitution doesn't actually say explicitly that these cabinet agencies, these cabinet members, all the way down to the entry-level FBI agent, it doesn't say anything about whether that person has to obey presidential orders. And so we've always thought that the power to fire, the power to remove, is the critical tool that the president has to make sure that vast bureaucracy obeys him and assists him. Otherwise, you could have a Justice Department, an Attorney General, and Justice Department just chooses to interpret the Constitution differently than the president and go its own way. So that's one. The second reason why you have this kind of confusion, Matt, is because Congress, over the decades, has vested large amounts of power in the executive branch underneath the president to do things like take care of the environment, take care of policing in DC, and so on, execute the IRS code, on and on and on. But when Congress gave that power away to the executive branch, it tried to keep some of it out of the president's hands by trying to create what we call independent agencies, executive agencies that are free of presidential control. And so presidents like President Trump, and he's not the first one. This started back in the days of even Franklin Roosevelt, who generally liked this vast welfare state, but at the same time, he wanted to control it and run it too. So presidents ever since, all the way culminating in President Trump, have tried to fight Congress about that. They have said, okay, you can give me all these powers, but I still get to decide how the executive branch is run. While as Congresses have said, we're going to give you these vast powers, but we're going to try to make the executive branch as independent of you as possible, because of course, then Congress can try to influence how the executive branch carries out its duties. So that fundamental pull, that fundamental tug and fight for control of the executive branch has been going on for decades. President Trump, I think, has just been the one that's been clearest and most true to those initial principles from the Constitution and its founding that we discussed, that all of the executive power of the federal government is vested in the president, and Congress can't try to undermine it by saying you can't fire this person or you can't fire that person.
Yeah, I mean, so these 2 points, I want to drill down into them because it's really important stuff. It's behind, so many of the headlines today, are going directly to these fundamental constitutional issues. It's just below the headlines. And when you think about first removal powers, I mean, if you can't fire anyone, as you said, you don't really have authority over them. You're not really in charge. You're not really the decider if you can't get rid of them. So, this is a long history of this building up, as you point out. Do you think in Trump's first term, how did he deal with that issue, or did it come up at all in terms of firing or getting rid of making changes in the administrative state or the large apparatus of government that he stands over?
He made important progress in his first term. He did fire a number of people, but more importantly, he tried to bring some of these independent agencies under the umbrella of the executive branch. The most important one of these, from the congressional perspective, is the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, which is the child of Senator Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren wanted to create this agency which could interfere in some of the most basic things every American uses, like credit cards, auto loans, home mortgages, on and on. And at the same time, she tried to create this agency with a single head who could not be fired by the president unless that person violated the law, committed a crime, essentially. So President Trump early on tried to fire that person and replace them. And this case went to the Supreme Court, and in a decision called Seala Law versus CFPB, the Supreme Court agreed with President Trump and said, yes, that person, the head of the CFPB, can't be independent of the president. The president must have the ability to fire that person because that person carries out federal law. Now, in the time between the two Trump administrations, there were fights, of course, but really it's come to a head in the first year of the second Trump term, because the agencies that the Supreme Court had upheld before from the New Deal, like the FCC, which is a communications commission, the SEC, which controls the financial markets. Ultimately, the Federal Reserve is the most independent of all these agencies. President Trump has been firing some of the heads of these agencies and taking cases that will ultimately get to the Supreme Court to say, well, Supreme Court, you have already agreed with this theory of what we call the unitary executive, that all executive power flows to the president. You have allowed us to fire the head of the CFPB and some other agencies. The only ones that are left are the ones from the New Deal, but they exercise vast power over the economy. President Trump in the second term is trying to bring those agencies under the umbrella of the presidency. And we're going to see, I think he's going to win, but those cases have to go to the Supreme Court. Some of them are very close to there now. And we're going to see in the next year or two whether the Supreme Court is willing to follow this principle all the way through to its logical conclusion.
I mean, that is the kind of stuff that people aren't talking about enough, but is actually truly exciting, because if he actually succeeds in the Supreme Court, you have reverted back to a constitutional principle where the president retains that power. But you know, I think we know how this will be played in the press, and we've already seen it. The claim will actually be President Trump is being a tyrant. This is fascist behavior. The president shouldn't control these sorts of things. No.
Sadly, that's right. You see people who I think know better attacking President Trump for being an autocrat or for trying to become a dictator. But I don't think President Trump sat around by himself in the Oval Office and thought up this idea. This is an idea that the Supreme Court has been pressing for 20 years now. This is one of the signal issues of the Roberts Court, has been to try to simplify the executive branch, to take away the independence of these administrative agencies, to place them under the direct and clear control of the president, mind you, because not just is the president in charge of taking care the laws are faithfully executed, but also the Supreme Court has observed rightly that we elect the president. That is the only way we as the American people can hold agencies accountable, is through our choice of president. And but it's not just the Roberts Court. As I said, this theory, this argument traces its origins all the way back to Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and the founding of our Constitution. So this is not some kind of crazy, radical new idea that President Trump thought up. This is actually, as you said, Matt, trying to restore this vast bureaucracy that's, I think, grown out of control, trying to restore it back to original constitutional principles.
Well, we hope that happens. So you think that this looks very positive in terms of the cases that are coming out, and have some hope that the court, as it stands right now, would actually rule in favor of the Trump administration.
Yeah, as you said, Matt, there's been these cases in the news, these skirmishes, for example. I would call them skirmishes, where, for example, President Trump has hired the head of the chair of the National Labor Relations Board and removed members of that board, and other these commissions that go back to the New Deal of the 1930s. And these people have sued and said my suing was unconstitutional. And they've, unfortunately, I think, got some trial judges here and there to agree, who've tried to stop President Trump's efforts to reduce the size of the executive branch, to downsize unnecessary functions, and to place these agencies under control of the presidency. And what's happened is that the Supreme Court has temporarily intervened, reached down into these cases and lifted the injunctions and said, for now, the president is able to fire them. If they want to get their jobs back, they can bring a case and try to get all the way to the Supreme Court in the normal course of business. So if you're to read the tea leaves of those cases, you would say, that looks to us, and some of the things the court has said in these very small temporary decisions, that looks to me as an external observer as a sign that the Supreme Court is intent on removing the independence from all of these agencies. The only one that the court has suggested it will not attack in terms of independence is the Federal Reserve. But I think it's suggested that all these other ones are going to be game for reconsideration.
It's always been wild to me how, in a way, I mean, you break it down very, very simply, and it makes practical. It's like business sense as well. You can't have this legislating body creating competitors to executive power that are somehow cabined from executive power and then therefore unaccountable to the people. But I'm very curious about, you mentioned the Federal Reserve. I mean, that's kind of the top, right? The case. This is the most independent agency, and it seems even now unfathomable that how could anyone? They're their own. Somehow we regard them as some kind of neutral. Their own body. But what's the difference there? Is that just tradition that people think, well, no, the Federal Reserve clearly is too powerful and too important to be underneath the president, and we're living a fantasy that it's somehow independent and therefore wonderful. But is there any real difference legally there? Is it really just the same principle should apply?
I agree with you, Matt. I don't see the constitutional distinction between the Federal Reserve and these other agencies, other than the Federal Reserve, which was created in 1914, by the way. It's not present at the founding, but there was a national bank that was present at the founding. But it was a very different creature than the one we're talking about today. Nevertheless, there are some justices on the Supreme Court who have said, even if we are to go down this path of making all of the administrative state accountable to the president through the ability to remove, maybe the Federal Reserve is a special one-off case because there was a national bank all the way at the beginning created in 1789-90. But I don't see the constitutional principle that saves it, and the court itself hasn't identified one. The only principle is more economic, that is just clear that for economic growth, you want to have a central bank that is somewhat independent. You don't want politicians setting interest rates. But of course, President Trump could do that himself. He could just say, I'm going to appoint this person, and I promise not to try to interfere with their decisions. And that might solve the problem. But I agree with you, Matt. I don't see how the Federal Reserve Bank itself should be independent when things like the NLRB, the FCC, and all these other independent agencies ultimately will be placed under presidential control.
So let's talk about all the the vast agencies and departments and all these tens of thousands of people who work within them. A lot of people who voted for Trump, I mean, there was really a majority in this country that wanted to see a house cleaning, and they wanted to see it the first time, frankly. I mean, they wanted the guy who says you're fired, to come in there. So if you were advising the Trump administration now on this, what needs to be done in terms of just the bureaucracy that already is technically under the president, but it's extremely difficult to get rid of people? I mean, we hear these horror stories all the time, right? I mean, mutual friend likes to tell a story about some guy who was looking at porn on his computers all day, right? It was almost impossible to fire him. I mean, there's many such cases, and you have very important roles where, these people do not agree with the mandate that President Trump has. So what would your advice be to them now in the second administration to take care of that problem?
So the first step, which President Trump has taken, I think is going to be fully successful, is making the first line, right? The cabinet secretaries, the heads of these agencies, subject to direct presidential command. Then the next level below that, I think, also has to be placed under presidential command too. And this is where the next fight will be. And I don't know how the Supreme Court's eventually going to come out on this, because the court has said that Congress can create a kind of civil service that has protections who are employees. So, for example, secretaries, the people who are involved in keeping the agency running day to day, but they don't make policy decisions. The Supreme Court has upheld giving them a kind of protection from being fired. I'm not sure actually constitutionally that was the original understanding, but that has something that's been around now for about 150 years. In between the cabinet secretaries and these employees is this middle area, the one that you are identifying, Matt, I think, which is people who make policy. So far, they've been protected by civil service rules. But I think those people also should be subject to presidential control. I think anybody who is making policy in the federal government within the executive branch has to be subject to presidential control. That's the next battleground, I think, for the Trump White House, is to claim the power to control that class of officials too. They're the ones who are really making policy on a day-to-day basis. And I think they're not just employees. I think they wield substantial authority. And if they do, then I think the president should be able to control them, because they too are really assisting him in carrying out his constitutional responsibilities. And if we don't have presidential control of those officials, then how do we as the American people, as the voters, ever hold them accountable?
Yeah. So one of the fascinating things to me about all of this is that it's Donald Trump at the end of the day, right, who has actually been pressing these issues in sort of the tip of the spear that people have been arguing about and wrangling about for a very, very long time. And I know, you wrote a book almost to me directed at all those people who sort of thought, oh, Trump's crazy. He's all over the place. And this media narrative about him being this wild and crazy character who really was a threat to our sacred democracy and all this sort of thing. You wrote a book explaining his presidency last time around. And so now you see more in general the way he's approaching the executive branch now. There's all these issues that have been popping up every day, from federalizing D.C., the DOJ, the Epstein files, the Russiagate stuff, right, coming out. And all of it revolves around, a very different president than we've seen in quite some time. So how do you kind of analyze in a bigger picture with some of these examples the way in which he's approached the office this term?
So thanks for mentioning that book. This is the book I wrote about his first term, Defender in Chief, I called it, because my argument there was, despite all these attacks, if you look at what Trump actually did, rather than what he says, but what he did, he was acting within, I think, what other presidents had done. Now, some of our greatest presidents have pushed the envelope of executive power, like Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, even presidents I don't agree with, like FDR, but they pushed the envelope of presidential power. And I don't think Trump was doing anything that was really outside the boundaries of what his predecessors had done. I think this term he is going beyond those boundaries, but he is really fulfilling the ideas of constitutional scholars who have really thought hard about the presidency. He's just the one who had the political cojones to do it. I mean, it's not a question of constitutional authority, I think. I think President Reagan could have done all these things, but even President Reagan felt politically constrained from attempting to really reform the executive branch, really to press presidential powers as far as people like a Hamilton or a Lincoln or a Jackson thought he could. So I think what President Trump is doing is he's reacting to the demand of the American people for serious reform in our political institutions. And as a result, he is turning to this wellspring of executive power which the Constitution makes available. From time to time, presidents have used it. And I think the ultimate, and I argued this in my first book too, ultimately the test of whether he should do this. And some of this is going to be historical. We're going to look back on his second term and say, was it the right thing to do? Would be, it's more of a decision of statesmanship. Do the times demand that the president turn to this reservoir of power and make it available? And that's something that only statesmen really can make the right judgment. And we, as you and I sitting as observers, can criticize, comment, praise, but it's really the person in the Oval Office who has to make that decision. Do the times fit the exercise of power?
Yeah, and your point is that the power is there. I mean, the executive power is there, and so much of what's being called tyranny and fascism, et cetera, is just simply, now a lot of it's just partisan nonsense, but a lot of it's what should we say, an ignorance about the power that exists constitutionally for the executive, and the fact that if you don't think it's politically prudent to do it, then you won't use it. But what I'm astounded by is, and I'm relishing, I enjoy watching, is just seeing the political will, right? The will is there to actually do things, to actually get things done. So let's talk about a few of those things. One of them, near and dear to my heart, is very concerning to me, is what we've seen in the last decade when it came to Russiagate or Russia collusion, these accusations against the president. This was my moment. I remember flying back from Washington, D.C., it was 2017 or 2018, and realizing how bad this was, like how, this corruption was within the DOJ, was within FBI. This stuff was nonsense. They'd been basically spying on the president, colluding with the media and spreading this stuff. And I remember being in the Department of Justice. I was like 12 years old, meeting Ed Meese, shaking his hand, and my dad saying, he's in charge of this whole building, right? And I thought, wow. I mean, at the soul of America is this notion of the rule of law, and that is broken down in some of the national security complex and in FBI and DOJ. So when you see that, now these documents are coming forth about what happened. What is your take on what's going on now and what should be done in the future? Because I think my worry and the worry of a lot of people in the audience is, there should be real structural reforms here. How do we make sure this sort of thing doesn't happen again? And how do we make sure we punish wrongdoers and make sure this isn't possible again? What's your take on all that?
First, we should remember that the president is the one under the Constitution who's given the duty to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. Mm-hmm. That means the president is, under the Constitution, the chief law enforcement officer in the United States. And so there you will see people who think that there should be some distance or separation between the president and the Justice Department, or that somehow it's wrong for the president to dictate who should be prosecuted and who shouldn't be, and where resources should be devoted for law enforcement. That's completely erroneous. It's the president who's in charge of law enforcement. And so if he wants to devote more energies, for example, on immigration removal, rather than, for example, environmental protection, that's up to the president. And we, by electing the president, we are the American people setting those priorities. So that's something important to remember. With this question, if there have been abuses in the past by the Justice Department and FBI, and I think the record shows that there were misuse of the vast powers we gave the government to actually chase foreign spies or to combat terrorism. And instead, there were people within our own law enforcement agencies who abused that power to instead attack political enemies and rivals or people they didn't like. Then they should be investigated, tried, and ultimately punished. And if President Trump wants to do that, he can. I've seen reports by the Inspector General at the Justice Department who has said that he thinks that some of these things happened. And he recommended people for prosecution, like the former director of the FBI, Jim Comey. And I've seen the head of the CIA, John Ratcliffe, who himself is a former federal prosecutor, refer for prosecution by the Justice Department, former heads of the intelligence agencies under the Obama administration. So these are not frivolous claims, and I think they should be investigated by the Justice Department today. In fact, I would say, having worked in the department in the years after 9/11, one thing that I never thought would happen again, because this was a mistake I think that was made during Watergate. One thing I thought would never happen again is that we would see our intelligence agencies, our counterintelligence, counterterrorism agencies use their powers, which are designed to protect the country from foreign threats, and instead turn it inwards for partisan political purposes. And if that has happened, then that has to be rooted out and punished, because we can't let that happen. The reason we give the government those powers is so that it can protect us from foreign attacks and foreign threats, not for domestic political purposes.
I really want to get to the judiciary at the end here, but I want to stick with this for a moment because it's so important right now and it's so concerning. Do you have thoughts about what the administration should do to reform the national security complex and some of those agencies to make sure that they return to actually protecting America and not being involved in domestic affairs or censoring people or all the things we've seen some evidence of over the last 10 years. Do you have any thoughts about what the administration should do?
I mean, this is a hard problem. I've always thought that we should shrink the size of the FBI. I've also thought that we should reduce the federal government's role in criminal policing domestically. That's a job that the Constitution gives primarily to the states. And I've always thought that we have over criminalized at the federal level. And maybe one solution is to point the CIA and the FBI and the NSA abroad and say, look, your original mission is to protect us from foreign threats, from foreign attacks. You should not be in the business of intervening domestically. And so, yes, the FBI plays an important role in domestic law enforcement, but maybe we should have less federal government involvement in criminal law at home and reorient our resources and attention to fighting and watching our rivals like China or Russia or Iran, and let the states take care of criminal law at home, except in truly national areas. And maybe that would be the start of a solution.
Sounds good to me. What about the judiciary? We have the initial flurry, right? Phase one of the Trump administration was all these executive orders, a lot of movement, clearly pre-planned. I mean, it was unbelievable to watch. And now you see parts of the administration locked into sort of more serious battles now that they've established themselves. But throughout this, everyone's had to watch all these court cases and this judicial activism throughout the nation. I mean, Trump has had unprecedented attacks or obstacles thrown up by the courts in these 6+ months. So what's your take on that? What should they do? Is this going to end? Is this going to continue? How do you view this?
I think one thing the American people are seeing, maybe for really clearly for the first time, is how decentralized and disorganized our federal courts are. We have about 800 active federal district judges, and I think they're what we call senior judges who are semi-retired. That brings that number up to 1,000. And any one of those judges had thought until this last summer that they could enjoin the entire federal government, the entire presidency, from pursuing a policy without check from any other individual judge at their level. You would have to go on these lengthy, expensive appeals to a court of appeals or even to the Supreme Court to overturn a single judge who, for example, disagreed with the president's order on firing or downsizing the executive branch. And so one thing is, yes, these trial judges, some of them have been waging a war against President Trump's agenda. And one thing we've seen so far is that the Supreme Court has to get the judiciary's house in order, and it's been trying. Every time these cases have gotten to the Supreme Court, the Trump administration has basically won, because what the Trump administration is asking the Supreme Court, saying, you, justices, get your own house in order. You can't allow one of 1,000 judges randomly picked or even actually deliberately picked to enjoin the policies of the entire federal government nationwide. And so every time the court has been presented with that, it has actually tried to narrow what trial judges can do. It's actually stripped away some of these cases from these trial judges. And it's been saying, we're going to start accelerating these cases to get to the Supreme Court as quickly as possible. Whereas I said, in our earlier discussion, I think the Trump administration is doing much better than people think, certainly much better than the critics of the Trump administration would have you believe, because I think the president in many of these areas has been trying to reassert the constitutional authority of the president over what the executive branch does.
Well, since we have a law professor with us today, I have to ask, are there any other cases or issues that you are keenly following or interested in when it comes to these matters, as we move forward, that may be off the radar for a lot of people?
Mm-hmm. Well, putting aside this question of the size of the presidency, I think the other major issue where our nation has been making great progress now with the return of President Trump, and where the Supreme Court has been very active, has been extinguishing the government's use of race in making decisions. We saw that in the Harvard case a few years ago, where the Supreme Court said state universities and private colleges that receive federal funds cannot use race when it picks who to admit, or when it picks who to hire, or who to fire. These are the rules that basically apply to the rest of American society, but the Supreme Court, I think, mistakenly had granted an exception to colleges and universities. Now, I think colleges and universities are still cheating and are still using race in all these decisions. And so what we've seen is the Trump administration is redoubling investigations and efforts to try to get universities to stop. And you can see how hard universities still deeply believe that they have the right to be racial engineers because they're still fighting back. So I think you're going to see more cases like that come to the Supreme Court. There's a big one that is already headed for the court has already agreed to hear it. So it's already on the docket, which would say that states can no longer consider race when they draw congressional districts. This is also a remaining area where Congress and the Supreme Court in the past, to overcome, I think, the shameful legacy of slavery and Jim Crow segregation, allowed the use of race to try to repair, to remedy all that bad history. And one of the ways they said to do it was you could take race into account when you draw congressional districts. But I think it's now about 60 years later, and it's time for our society to stop using race there too. There's a Supreme Court case now that will ask the justices, should congressional districts that were drawn deliberately with the consciousness of race, for example, to try to put as many minorities as possible in a congressional district so that they will vote for somebody of their race, which I think is actually a pernicious assumption about the way minorities think. I'm not going to vote for an Asian to be my member of Congress just because he or she's Asian. I care about their policies and what they would vote for. I think that's a case that's going to be on the court's docket this year. And I think if the court does the right thing, and say no more use of race in drawing congressional districts, that will be another step towards progressing towards really getting us to a colorblind society.
Well said. It is astonishing how the Civil Rights Act is being used by the Trump administration to say, hey, this was the deal. This was what we thought we were about as Americans. And yet we have these recalcitrant institutions who don't want to do this. So what do you think? I'm curious about the universities. Do you think that they, now they're feeling the pressure that they will actually change? It strikes me that might take a while because, like you say, they'll just try to hide it for a while.
I have to say, I think the Trump administration has been making remarkable progress on this front. I think that universities have really, and I've been saying this for many years, ever since I was a professor, really, that universities have gone seriously off track in their use of race in all kinds of decisions. And when they've been caught, they just hide it. That's where we got this DEI industry from. They just changed the name to diversity, equity, inclusion from pure racial quotas, which the American people, huge majorities of American people, including minority groups, hate and don't want done. And so I always thought it would be a long time. It would take a lot of work and time to uproot this pernicious ideology from the way our universities operate. So I think, even though I agree with everything the Trump administration has proposed to do to universities, I agree with a lot of it. And because I think that There has to be this kind of big bang to try to wake up people within our universities to prevent them from using race anymore. And I think they've been making a fair amount of progress. They made a lot of progress with a settlement with Columbia University. We'll see if they settle with Harvard too. But the proof is going to be in the pudding in this respect. These universities, they might agree and say, yes, we'll pay $200 million fine, $500 million fine, and we promise not to use race ever again. But their record has not been good, because when they've agreed, or not agreed, when they've been forced by the courts, stop using race, I think they just cheat. They cheat. And I think everyone knows they're cheating. And so part of what the Trump administration has to do is not just win these settlements, but to stay on top of the universities to make sure that they keep their word. Because otherwise, I think they're just going to go back to their bad old ways again.
Well, John, thanks so much for your time today. Your blessing to California. And when you want to come back to America, America welcomes you with open arms.
Thanks, Matt. It's great to be with you. But as you can see, in California, it's also sunny and warm all the time too, year round. So it's hard to leave California too, which means that's why the government can tax us and overregulate us, because they know the weather still keeps us here.
True. Thank you.
Well, that is a fascinating conversation. We'll break it down in just a moment, but first, in a world that has gone fully digital, holding something in your hands is almost revolutionary, and that's what Frontier Magazine is. Matt's beautifully displaying this right now for us. It's a real permanent thing that you actually can go through and hold in your hands. And right now, Frontier Magazine by Blaze Media is back. That is issue number 3.
I'm reading The Long Road Home by our own Rob Eno. Pictures from across the country on this road trip. It's incredible stuff. He really did a great job with that. And then I see Death to Seed Oils here. That's a great thing to read and practice in your life.
MAGA, MAHA, it's all coming together in issue number 3. But the only way to get Frontier Magazine is through Blaze Unlimited. And it's not just your ticket to Frontier. You'll also get all of the VIP perks, early event access, members only content, all a premium experience built for the people that just want more. And it's just, go through and actually read it and hold it and own it yourself. So you can go to blazeunlimited.com/VNT right now and lock in your subscription before we sell it out again. And the first 50 subscribers who use the code BLAZE50 will get $40 off and receive a special digital bonus. And plus, you'll get digital access to Frontier issues number 1 and 2. So you'll have the entire thing from the start. It's blazeunlimited.com/BNT, promo code BLAZE50. Now, I absolutely loved that conversation. Let's get into it a little bit more. John, you, fascinating, brilliant guy. You can tell that from the start. But let's go into Donald Trump and just the way that he is going through and taking back all of the power from the bureaucracy right now.
Yeah, so everyone thinks about, the president needs to come in and fire all these people. And of course, you got a lot of people, civil service, you can't fire the bureaucrats. That's a longer term project to make sure that I think the president should be able to literally fire anyone in the government. But what you pointed out, very simple. All executive authority rests in the president. And the problem is you have all these agencies and independent boards and all these things that Congress creates, right? Congress creates them and throws them out there, but they take power away from the presidency, and they're not under the president. So they're under no authority. Like, Congress creates power, right? Grabs it from the president, really should be executive, and throws it out there, all the way up until your favorite, the Federal Reserve. That's Jill's favorite government.
Did you even know that was absolutely going to come up? You knew it already, because as soon as I heard that in the interview, I was like, we're going Federal Reserve on a Friday night.
And what John said is really there's no constitutional reason that shouldn't be underneath the president. You can't create these independent bodies of experts, as we've learned over the last decade and more. They're not really independent, and these things can be messed with. So I think that what he revealed in this interview was, look, in the first part of the Trump administration, they started to go after some of the weaker ones, and now they're going to go after really everything. And I think everything's on the table. We could really see the executive branch regain power, constitutional power that the executive had in the beginning and should have retained the entire time. And that's going to help rein in this runaway bureaucracy.
So if he's going to do that, there are going to be building blocks that you need to do this in. There's going to be an order of operations, right? Where do you want to see things get started to make all of this happen?
Well, so for these independent, quote unquote, agencies that Congress makes, delegating power out to these unaccountable bodies, that's already underway. They're already going after them. They're already firing people, and those court cases are going to go to the Supreme Court, and there's a great chance the Supreme Court rules the right way. When it comes to firing people, as John said, and rightly, first you need to make sure that your cabinet secretaries are directly, Pam Bondi and other people are directly taking orders from the White House, from the president. That's the president's job, to actually command these people. It's not supposed to be the case that they're all independent. That's crazy. You elect the president. It's the only person that we elect to take care of the entire government. So you see the White House asserting that position. The political will is there, and they already fully understand in this administration that they run the show. The boss is the boss when it comes to those who run all these cabinet, all the cabinet secretaries and others appointees who run these agencies and departments. So that's good, right? That's number one. Number two, as he said, there's a bunch of mid-level people who are still out there making policy, and that is coming next. I mean, those are the battles that you see unfolding now as people find out, wait a minute, this person isn't on my side. They need to go. And that might be adjudicated. That might go to the courts too, but that's the next step before you get to the rank and file bureaucrats in the civil service system.
This administration has done such a great job with social media and going through and making like viral memes that go out and just embracing that. You have a president right now that is literally known for going out there and making a phrase, "You're fired," so well known in the American lexicon. I would love to see the White House social media team lean into that. Use what you have at your disposal if you're trying to educate the American people on how these things need to be done. Social media, and especially the team that they have, knowing they can execute this, what are we waiting for?
Yeah, no, and this is the next step. It's happening, as John said. If they're related, if you're in the government in that mid-tier bureaucrat level and you're actually involved in making policy, that policy has to reflect the president of the United States. So you're going to hear all these people say fascism and all this, Trump's a tyrant, he's ruining democracy, when in fact he's restoring American democracy by leaning into and restoring the actual power that the founders gave the president of the United States.
And legacy media will continue to lie to you. They'll continue to tell you that these things that are happening just aren't so. This is what we've seen. All of the stories that we've brought you the entire week, Matt, is just, legacy media, the intel community, everybody out there is trying to lie because they were very afraid of one Donald Trump before he even assumed the oath of office the very first time.
Yeah, but what's going on is they just use all the worst names they can think of, racism, fascism, tyranny, whatever. They throw that at anyone who seeks to hold them accountable and actually restore Republican government to the United States of America.
It's one heck of a week here. Thanks for watching, everybody. Have a great weekend. We'll see you back here on Monday.